A call to Sam Sedar to discuss inflated markets turns into a discussion about lumber prices and an epidemic of mountain pine beetles, which I'm now sure doesn't exist. So either Sam, a call-in fact checker, CNN, and a litany of other sources are wrong, or I'm obviously well on my way to becoming a bird denier. Let's find out.
What markets are inflated that are impacting inflation?
Oh, lumber? Have you looked at the lumber?
Yeah, have you
market?
looked at what's going on in Canada with the beetles? Have you looked at what's going on in terms of building? I mean, we had a run.
Beetle.
Beetles.
Yeah.
The mountain pine beetle in May of 2021.
Right.
Attacked 50% of 18 million hectares of forest. Go and look at what's happening in March and May in the spring of what happened to the supplies of Canadian pine.
The easiest way of debunking this is Googling those statistics that Sam mentioned, and finding they're basically from 2012, though it's not really Sam's fault for using them. But why did I say basically? Well, let's look at the data and uncover the mystery behind the mountain pine beetle hysteria. Here we have a chart representing 2010 data for merchantable pine volume for mountain pine beetle epidemic in British Columbia. It includes their future projections. We'll delete those. We'll add in data up to 2012 via this 2013 study, where we are down to 11 million cubic meters of pine killed per year, displayed as the blue bar correlating to numbers on the right. And estimate for the total affected pine volume at this point is 723 million, represented by our red line. We can double check these numbers and find what was basically the statistics Sam had quoted during our call.
Attacked 50% of 18 million hectares of...
Now with some context, over 18 million hectares of forests were impacted to some degree, resulting in a loss of approximately 723 million cubic meters, 53% of the merchantable pine volume by 2012, end quote. Next, we'll add data from 2015, where we are down to 1 million cubic meters per year of pine volume affected. And finally, the latest data available cites from 2017, where the overall estimate of damage was raised to 752 million cubic meters, though per year estimates are no longer available at this point. As now we have a good sense as to the current status of the mountain pine beetle epidemic in British Columbia, it's time to quote, "Meet the beetle ravaging Canadian forests, driving up U.S. lumber prices," end quote. And although this article will put those statistics we reviewed earlier in some context, I have no doubt the average reader will come away thinking the ravaging was an ongoing phenomenon. After all, the title states exactly that. Here's another offender, though they weren't so kind as to add any context to their statistics. And we understand why we're seeing 5-year-old statistics being quoted. That, by the way, are largely representative of damage done 10 years prior to that. It's because there is no current statistics, as there is no current epidemic. And by the way, because these beetles require a certain type of tree of at least a certain age to proliferate with any accelerated proficiency, these outbreaks have in the past occurred between gaps of 20 to 40 years. So although Sam was wrong in our call, wrong, it is a bit understandable. Wrong. Some of these articles, though, are making the case that because Canada strives to produce lumber at sustainable levels, that the beetle epidemic had modified the mid to long-term production levels, and to a point, that is an objectively true statement. It's also barely relevant as it pertains to a supposed acute shift in supply doing its part for the unprecedented price jump we experienced in 2021. So, ignoring that for the moment, as the more pressing issue is that most readers come away from practically all of the articles listed here thinking that there is an active beetle epidemic in Canada. They state how many trees or the affected area, but they never get around to mentioning that the epidemic has long since been over. So I emailed Sam soon after our call, noting my issues with the beetle articles citing old data, Though I could have been more thorough in doing so or included more sources, I was more interested in better explaining my inflation theory, and I guess I thought he wouldn't have any reason to doubt me.
I was going to call in about the inflation caller you've had, I think, like a week or so ago. You had somebody call in about wood prices.
So there's a lot of things,
Yeah,
and the bug, and the beetle up in the pine up in Canada.
If you track the price fluctuations, you can actually see when they come out of dormancy, how it did actually impact it in the short term. But yeah,
Jesus ass. Okay. Let's make sure we dispel this here and now, if we haven't already done so, by first noting that the beetles, quote, don't go into the wood, they eat the living part between the bark and the wood, end quote. That is to say that the lumber of these dead trees isn't worthless. In fact, it loses no value for at least several years and can be viable as lumber for 10 to 15 years, which is why during the actual epidemic had raised the annual allowable cut rate, or AAC, on publicly owned land and were even subsidizing the harvest of these so-called beetle kill forests. Quote, the epidemic, which took off in the early 2000s, spurred a massive salvage operation in BC as sawmills raced to process and export timber before the dying trees lost market value, end quote. So even in the fantasy world where there is an active beetle epidemic in Canada, the current production of lumber wouldn't be lower, it would be higher. Moreover, these brain-dead cretins writing these articles would compare the number of active mills and level of production in 2021 to that of 2005, which was not only the height of the beetle infestation, but also of a housing boom. The very decrease in lumber production being cited as evidence of a beetle epidemic is ironically the product of there no longer being a beetle epidemic. I'll finish with the beetles by noting the worst two offenders. One is an article from the Financial Post. Not just the first article to write about the beetles in 2020, but they were so bold as to note that destruction of marketable pine trees as to be happening up to 2020. The same author would publish an article in Bloomberg a few months later. Many articles after that would quote those two articles. But the publishing of those was no excuse for CNN's article, who went and interviewed one of the heads in the field and misquoted her, making it seem like she was describing an current epidemic of beetles when she was describing one 15 years from the past.
There are a few reasons why, but the problem begins in the Canadian Rockies, the source of almost 1 in every 3 boards hammered into American homes, and where a plague of beetles arrived with the power to kill 100,000 trees a day. So many, you could hear them over the phone.
And you could actually hear the beetles underneath the bark. He says, I'm listening to my trees being killed.
Oh my God. Forest biologist Janice Cook has studied the invasion of mountain pine beetles for decades. Just one effect of an overheating planet.
Warmer overwinters and hotter, drier summers, we saw those populations not only rise to epidemic levels, but in some areas what we call a hyperepidemic.
Mountain pine beetles attack a single tree like an invading army, and to defend itself, the lodgepole pine fills its cracks with this sticky chemical compound we know as pitch. Well, this turns out to be highly flammable. So in the end, if the beetles win, you've got a 50-foot fire starter. Beetle Kill Forest helped accelerate those western megafires, and altogether, 50 million acres have been lost up here, an area the size of Minnesota.
We have more than 30 mill closures in the interior of BC alone. Mills are not running 24/7 anymore.
In the meantime, there is the 40-year-old trade war with the...
I have no doubt the readers or watchers of this video will come away thinking that there is an active beetle epidemic in Canada, when that couldn't be further from the truth. Here's Canada's lumber production and shipping charts. Here's the sum result of a demon plague of beetles, massive COVID shutdowns, layoffs, mill closures, and supply line issues. Yeah. Moving on. For the demand shift responsible for a 300% jump in prices, Reuters estimates that the increase in do-it-yourself style home improvement projects had jumped 7.5% in 2020. My numbers, calculated with the change in Lowe's and Home Depot customer volume, puts that value closer to 11%. Note that not all projects would actually use lumber. Moreover, some reports indicate the home improvement trend may have subsided by 2021, when after a slower than expected 2020, housing starts had increased by 17%. So, are those numbers sufficient in meriting a 300% increase in lumber prices? I'm not going to get into my theory, which involves inflated markets creeping into commodity futures. This video is supposed to be about beetles after all. I will leave you with some food for thought. It's a well-researched and extremely well-timed study published in December of 2019. It reviews 30 years of lumber markets and concludes that lumber demand is inelastic to price. That is to say, it contends that an increase in lumber prices wouldn't stop most construction projects that use it. They would just push the added costs onto the buyer. Hi there. Thanks for watching to the end. Please like or subscribe to support independent investigative journalism and strange anime characters giving you the news.